Well, this is great. I want to welcome everybody to our Tuesday talks. We didn't have anything last week because we were in residency, and it was our first virtual residency. All of our classes were held through Zoom, and I think we had a successful week. It was definitely a learning experience for all of us. It's not that we were not used to being on some kind of mediated form like WebEx or Illuminate or Zoom now, but having to sit and lecture in a 3.5 hour block made it just a little bit more challenging for us and for those that were at home and having to take care of their kids and do their business and all of that as well. So here we are back, and we're back with a distinct focus.
Hello.
We're on a distinct focus with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I have to thank 3 of our MCM grads for driving this discussion and for beginning to help organize this. And that's Gail, who is our presenter today, Charlene Carrington, and Sarah Goldvine from BC, who a couple weeks ago, we had just a wonderful planning session. And over the next 8 weeks, we're going to have a number of MCMers and a number of other special guests talk about issues that are important, not just to the world of public relations, but society, obviously, and how we operate and we navigate interesting and challenging conversations. And so this is the series that will have both issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion talking about will be led through careful discussions as well. And I welcome your involvement and your participation as well. So I'm going to turn it over to a woman who started the MCM program in 2014, who came from a non-traditional public communications background. In fact, had more of a legal, organizational development background. And after finishing the MCM program, has gone on to work for some great global brands and global corporations as well, and is now with Accenture in the organizational transformational spot. She's a guru, a leader in this field. And I just want to thank you, Gail, for everything that you've done to help us move forward this discussion. And I look forward to our discussion today with this. And by the way, you have the record now for the number of people on one of these. So no pressure here.
No pressure. Thank you.
It's all on you now.
Thank you so much, Terry, and absolutely everyone who's joined this afternoon. I'm just going to get into it because really it's a great dialogue. And if any screens are in the way, please do let me know. I think we have we're in an interesting time. I'd like to definitely take advantage of the dialogue that's on the street, bring it into the corporate world, and really bring it into the corporate world with great meaning. I'm opening the conversation today about the role of corporate PR in the Black Lives Matter movement, starting with this visual of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tomite. Really, the overall dialogue today is about our role as trusted advisors, is how I'd like to define us in the corporate space. Our role within the Black Lives Matter movement, Canada's corporate response, which everyone has been eagerly paying attention to and listening to, and using Accenture as a case study, as the case study and an example of how we responded to this conversation. The nerves that you see and hear is very real. I can't hide it. Everyone who knows me knows that I'm very visual. So I start with this quote from Audre Lorde, who's an American writer, womanist, and feminist. She says, "When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak." And that is absolutely the conversation that I've had internally with myself over the past few weeks. I shared that internal dialogue with my closest friends and family and colleagues who I felt I could have that dialogue with. And I decided to speak because I think it's a necessary conversation. it just so happened that I was also working on my APR, and as we are, the education and the experience that we have in the corporate world, but also leaning on my legal experience, we tend to want proof. Give me the precedent, give me the evidence and the experience as to why I feel that I can take this position. So I happen to find it, leaning on some of the ethics experience and the ethics dialogue and research that's already been out there by PR and corporate PR professionals. And my favorite is Grunig. Going back to MCM 101, Grunig really described exactly what he described, that we are in one of two roles, or we play one of two roles as corporate communications professionals, the careerist or the decision maker. And in the text, Managing Public Relations, Grunig and Hunt did discuss this. They discussed that many practitioners tend to hold more of a careerist value than professional values. And when I say this, it doesn't mean that we are not being professional, but we tend to work for the organization, placing a higher importance on job security, prestige, and other things that we need to do to live our lives. We act as technologists in communications, but we aspire to be decision makers. And this is where I sort of had this internal push and pull and dialogue within myself. I'm sure most of us in the room want to be the trusted advisor. We look at a lot of corporate communications roles and think, why isn't there a C-suite position? Where are we as the chief communications officer? Where are we advising our leadership about issues internally and externally? What is beautiful about the role that corporate communications or communications PR plays is that we look internal to the organizations we work for, but also external to the stakeholders that we also have to take care of. And so Shannon Bowers said it best, the ethical advocate and the burden of the public and employer interests, PR standards, and personal values. All of these four issues are constantly circling within us as trusted advisors. But I think in the end, we have a sense of independence and responsibility to society and the public interest. So we really need to look at the wholesome role that we play, looking internally and externally, regardless of where it sits. So I move into now the conversation of Black Lives Matter in that context. A group agreement. It is a difficult conversation for some. It is a common conversation for others. I understand that I don't understand, and still I stand. This is a group agreement that we internally to Accenture discussed as we were walking through a few exercises. It came from the Teaching Tolerance Project, Southern Poverty Law Center in the US. It is not uncommon to see this kind of group agreement as we open dialogue that's two-way and should be, honest and carefully discussed, but honestly discussed. So I continue to say what I would love everyone in the room to do is recognize your comfort or discomfort, recognize where you are in the temperature of the dialogue of anti-Black racism. From I would rather not talk about it to I'm very comfortable talking about it. And wherever you are, it's okay. What I would love for you to do is think of racism as a perennial. Think of it as something that is always around, it never leaves, and it is quiet. Racism essentially addresses the privilege to use and silence around the institutions that were built on white supremacy. The moniker today that's more commonly heard is the term racism. I have been benefited from that system of racism as well. I have to recognize that. So that internal dialogue that I'm asking everyone to sort of take of their own selves, I've had with myself. I have an anglicized name. I fit a European standard of presentation. I am fairer complexioned, and there is privilege in that. I'm also a cisgender female. Not to say that I don't have to deal with sexism and ageism and all the other isms that I've had to walk through my life with, but racism has played a very forefront position in my life, and I had to recognize where I sit in that privilege, and understand that I am where I am today and that comfort in racism because I listened, I learned, and I acknowledged it. There is no way I can explain racism, over 500 years of systemic racism, within this context. The names on the left represent some Canadian, Indigenous, and Black people who have lost their lives. The latest of which we know is Ijaz Chowdhury due to mental illness, and Defont Miller, who was in the news due to the beating that happened a few years back. Racism we see and don't see. As I said, it's a perennial, it's always around. What is not accepted in society are the things that you see above the water, which are mean things, racial insensitivities, even microaggressions. While it's at the top, I feel that it really is something that is beneath the surface, but everything else under the surface of what you see on this diagram is what is considered institutional racism. And where that shows up is across all of these industries. So while people may think, well, you know, I don't have Black people in my organization, or I've never experienced racism in my neighborhood, and, you know, my neighbors get along, and the idea is the construct of where you are in the society and how your neighborhood and how your organization and how your city has been developed is a part of the systems that perpetuate racism. So it's really important to take a look at the dialogue and the conversation out there. Racism stems from imperialism and colonialism and slavery and. So for anyone to suggest that they don't see it, you really have to sort of revisit that dialogue within yourself and do some research. I can't possibly explain it all today, but I say it so that we can premise the dialogue that's happening in the corporate world with this understanding. And I think it's necessary to have this premise, sort of this foundation, the roots of the dialogue, before you can really reach out to your colleagues, counterparts, dominant coalition to have that dialogue. I mentioned the research on the left side because I think our society has really tried to address some of the issues in employee experience and inclusion and diversity, organizational culture and psychology. They've layered and sort of had a lot of reputation management, crisis responses. We've had these dialogues over and over and over without actually hitting it on the nail to say, there are some systems that perpetuate racism that need to be addressed. We can't talk about a lot of the crises that have happened over the years. Not all of them, but some of them are definitely rooted in racism. So open eyes and get comfortable being uncomfortable until this conversation really surfaces the way it should. So bringing us now to Canada's corporate response. We've all seen them. We've all seen the responses that have taken place. And I think as they were coming in, I'm not suggesting that any of these responses were the right way, the wrong way, or the way it should be. Every organization, like every household, has the internal work that was already done, so that they can take a position. Others are just starting to have this dialogue. So they know that what's happening in the world right now is something's wrong, but not quite sure how to name it. Because again, if you've not had those conversations that I discussed previously, if you're sort of not looking at, well, we don't have mean graffiti and people don't outwardly not hire people of color. If you don't have those truthful dialogues, it would be difficult for the growth of the response to be about anti-Black racism. So I don't know if you're seeing it. So ultimately, it is what happens inside the organization, regardless of the statements that are made, regardless of how and the tone, regardless of how much content is behind them. I think what we have to be respectful, and I, as a person of color, as a Black woman in Canada, I am okay with an organization making a statement like this is not the time to be silent, and hope that they continue whatever processes are required internally in order to get to a larger position on anti-Black racism in Canada. So overall, the conversations have been threefold. I've seen a segment of responses that stand against racism because they're sort of taking the position, but they're not quite sure what to do next. They know racism is wrong, but they don't really know what entails racism. They haven't actually had that, again, that internal dialogue about the systems that perpetuate racism. Not really sure how to pinpoint 5, 6, or 7 things that they can say in the organization we're going to change. So they're in the early stages. Not sure how to read their internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, not sure how to broach the conversation, probably not even had it with themselves first. The next segment of responses I noticed are anti-racist. So you've come out, you're saying we are going to be anti-racist. But again, not quite sure how to extend that conversation to say, what is being anti-racist actually? Again, the conversation within myself was, I'm looking at my privilege. I have an Anglo name. I probably wasn't sifted away in terms of, HR opportunities, or if someone looked at my name and thought maybe I might be of a different race, I didn't have to worry about that until I walked into the room. And in most cases, when I walked into the room, I could see on their face, oh, she's Black. So there is an anti-racist commitment to fight, but not sure how are we going to fight against racism. And then, of course, the last category, or the last segment, is we are affecting anti-Black racism. Here's an action statement. We have the organizational structures in place. We know exactly what we're going to do. We know exactly what the issue is, or we have to tweak some. No one is perfect. And again, the conversation evolves, and you don't know what you don't know. So in a lot of cases, when an organization is in the third segment, they are probably at the stage of, we know there's a problem, but we're not quite sure what the problem is. But we have the structures in place to actually address the problem and create meaningful and measurable change ongoing. That brings me to Accenture, where I happened to apply and started working for, excuse me, specifically because I saw representation. I'll be honest, it was one of the most outwardly diverse organizations that I saw in the management consulting space. Others definitely had an approach to diversity, but there was just something that was a little bit more measurable. And I applied, and I've been working there since last year. So I started working at Accenture in 2019, and when this conversation and dialogue started about Black Lives Matter, kicked off with Amy Cooper in the park, and the other events that took place thereafter on that week in May. The statement that was developed with, and which I have so much respect for, and I don't know if anyone's on the call, but the marketing comms machine behind Accenture really moved into quick action in terms of, this is not right, and we're going to do something about it. The reason I have 2 dates on the bottom was because, unbeknownst to me, Julie Sweet, our global CEO, made.
Hi, can everyone see me?
I can, Yasmin. Yep.
Okay, hi.
Yasmin.
I'm Yasmin. I'm Gail's daughter. She just asked me to continue on while we're waiting, so we don't sit in silence, so we can at least be productive. I'm majoring in communications and media studies with a double minor in African studies and anthropology, and I'm also a professional soccer player for Team Jamaica. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because even recently I've had to speak about systemic racism within my own university. She brought up a point that I think is very important. We tend to do hashtag activism when it comes to organizations. And that's where we see like the entire world is speaking about Black Lives Matter. So let's quickly get on our marketing team and let's change the colors and make everything Black so that we can be in solidarity with this movement. But that's not necessarily fundamental change. And I see that a lot with a lot of organizations where on the surface level, we're going to present perfect. It's okay. Continue.
Hey, wait a second. I want to keep hearing her story.
Okay.
Come on.
I was
just finish it off. That's an excellent story.
Okay. I just feel like even at my university, we've had soccer players where they never had any Black people on the cover of any of their promotions for the games. But the second that Black Lives Matter became a trending hashtag online, they went into their archives to search for Black athletes to present to the media. And I'm like, that's wrong. There's no fundamental change. You just used our faces for something that is beneficial to you in this moment. So I feel like a lot of us get caught up in hashtag activism where we think that like if we change our brand colors or if we post a Black screen on our social media platforms that it's doing something, when within the actual system of the organization, we're not looking at, hey, like, why are Black people not being hired? Maybe it's because there's not enough diversity higher up in the organization. So that's just something that I really want to say because my mom made that point. So I feel like there's not a lot of fundamental change. It's very surface level.
Yasmin, thank you very much for that. We've had a case of Black athletes at McMaster just starting to speak out as well earlier this week. So I think there's a lot of internal reflection going on within universities. And what I think that this has done is allowed students and people to speak up. And I think this is what we want. And Gail has been a leader in this to be able to help us do this as well. And you're at University of Ottawa studying?
Carleton.
Oh, Carleton, my alma mater. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Go Ravens. Yeah.
Thank you so much for stepping in. This is the expectation. So I did plan for this. I asked my daughter to step in if possible. And I also, anyway, the point is I'm glad that the conversation continued. And what Yasmin talked about was sort of the way that racism permeates throughout all organizations at all levels, from kindergarten to retirement. So going back to the Accenture response, which was very great, what took place in 2016 was a response that Julie Sweet had started because of the Philander Castile death and the riots that took place in Ferguson. So a corporate response was sent out. And then what she did, which I thought was wonderful, was when she publicly made the statement for June 4th, 2020, she also layered onto that, here are some things that we did in 2016. Here are some of the systemic changes that we said we would make. Here is where we are in 2020. We still have some work to do. That was the same information sent internally that was sent externally. So when we look at, again, the two-way conversation and the two-way dialogue that's expected in terms of our stakeholders and being a communications professional, what you say inside should match what you say outside. But of course, have the systems internally that create that ability for you to stand behind the changes that you say your organization will make structurally. So we had a COVID campaign, which was great. They actually leveraged a lot of the work that was done with COVID, and they had a what to do now, what to do next campaign. They took that same campaign dialogue and they said, this is what we're doing now. Immediately, so just to go back a little bit, to say that some of the structures were already in place, Accenture has a wonderful ERG, Employee Resource Group machine. You know, every group that you can think of, from parents to Indigenous populations, have the support of having dialogue internally, but also allyship externally, so that people also learn about the cultures and learn how to be an ally. Our Black interest group, which we call BOLD, was formed in April of 2019. And it was sponsored by our CEO, Jeffrey Russell, which was great. From the get, we had senior leadership sponsorship, which makes all the difference. On April 30th, he has this open door, very two-way dialogue to the point where my first day, I didn't realize he was the CEO. He walked through sort of the halls. You didn't know who he was, but he was just, hi, everyone, how you doing? And a few months later, oh, that's the Jeffrey. And I decided, since we have COVID and I can take advantage of the fact that he's no longer traveling as much, I just thought it's time for a one-on-one. Had a very great conversation with him. Thereafter, in April, a few weeks later, Black Lives Matter and the whole conversation around the world started. And Salesforce was the first response that I put out. In the conversation that I had with Jeffrey on April 30th, I had asked him about allyship. And it would be great to see that BOLD, which was then an interest group, would discuss more allyship conversation. We moved that conversation into, oh my goodness, look what Salesforce did, into, hey, we need a corporate response. Now, I'm not suggesting that what I said prompted that. I'm sure there were dialogues and conversations that were happening with our US counterparts as well. But the idea is something is wrong, and we have a population of employees who are hurting, and we need to do something about it. So very immediately, almost immediately, an email came out from Jeffrey to the BOLD interest group. An email went out the next week, probably the Monday, to all of Canada. And that was followed by a global response on June 4th, which is the one I spoke about from Julie Sweet. So all of the leadership, Jeffrey in Canada, Jimmy in the US, Jimmy Etheridge, Julie Sweet, all J's, yes, globally, they all came together and sort of evaluated the dialogue, had signatures of commitment from all of the leadership teams, and then we started the open forums. These open forums were two-way dialogues that took place. We had 3 of them. It was led by our I&D team in collaboration with our Black interest group and our Indigenous group. And it was, it had a very great response of at least 250 people per session. We then moved into what to do next. We took all of that dialogue and we suggested, here are some of the things that we need to do. And I know I'm just mindful of time, and I'm sure that this will be shared, but I would really like to get to a little bit more deeper into why this was beneficial.
Yeah, take your time. Don't worry about it.
Okay. So our Black ERG and Canadian leaders also looked at conversation in more detail, looking at some of the key themes that came out. And I can say, even before I share some of those key themes, everything that we talked about, I could have been in another organization and said exactly the same thing. So it's common themes, and I present it to also encourage you to look out for what are some of the common themes that you might expect should you do this exercise in your organization. We then had a global dialogue, which was a great response again, 30% participation from our workforce of 509,000. So yes, globally, we're a large team, but imagine that globally, we have a diaspora of experiences of Black. Not everyone is African American. What happened in the US absolutely is the worst case of overt racism, but we have folks in South Africa. We have folks in, other parts of Africa. We have folks in Asia as well. So we have a global workforce that I think Accenture really did a great job of building those bridges and bringing us all together. And then the third step was we then took all of that information and we're starting to do some inclusion and diversity planning. What my mother would always say, good, better, best. It's good. How can it be better? And how can we be the best at our I&D work? And then, of course, we continue with the collaboration now that we have been introduced more closely to our African American ERG, African American and Black ERG. It really is great support for the work that we do. So if I had to translate that into a smaller scope and said, if your organization is across Canada and your Toronto ERG is bigger, let the Toronto team really be used as an anchor for the others across Canada. If you're local to a city and one ERG in Surrey is bigger than the ERG in Victoria, let that help to anchor, again, the conversation and dialogue. Each one teach one. Some of the themes that were identified, I would bucket into 3 areas. And those 3 areas are personal, career, and employer. And again, this is probably something that you would see regardless of the organization that you work for. I think it's important to understand some of these terms that are coming out, because this conversation here was definitely a more internal within the Black community and Indigenous community. We understand some of this terminology and maybe our counterparts do not. So, emotional tax, it's something that we have to carry, we bring to work. I literally left Bay Street because I had to make a decision to carry that emotional tax and raise my daughter, or, climb my way up the ladder and know that my personal life didn't necessarily have the support that I needed to be able to come home or leave it at the door. The emotional tax of being Black in corporate America or corporate Canada. You see a lack of representation or not enough representation. 1 or 2 at the top is more so tokenism, which is also a system of racism. Barriers to progress. How do I get to the top? What do I need? What are some of the relationships that I need to build? And then, of course, from the employer, what are things that they can do? This new language that needs to be developed and understood, an open dialogue about even saying the word. I find that in the conversations that I've had of late, people are afraid. I identify as Black. It is okay to say that I am Black. Ask, though. I mean, it's no different really than the parallel conversation that took place in the LGBTQ community. It's no different than the dialogue that takes place in ableism. How do you speak to a person who is in a wheelchair, going down to their level or speaking at their level or not bending to their level? It depends. Just ask. Overall, I think why I wanted to identify this is because in anti-Black systemic racism training, a lot of the dialogue that we should be having or could be having as communications professionals, people who are leading the way in anti-Black racism training is having this dialogue. And when I say this dialogue, I mean 7 out of the 10 expectations that Grunig had about an excellent organization, they are bringing that into the forefront when they talk about how we can build bridges, unraveling language, two-way dialogue, learning a new language, having a courageous and difficult conversation, but having it, really not letting the dominant group perspective sort of weigh the weight in the room. The idea is we can't afford not to talk about race because it shows up in a lot of the crisis communications and crisis issues that we have to manage thereafter anyway. So why not put your house in order and make sure that we are clear, we are clearly having these open dialogues so that we can do something about anti-Black racism. So I won't dive into this too deeply. We all know what Grunig's excellence theory is, those of us who are communications professionals, but those who are not are doing this intrinsically anyway. But these are some of the structural things that need to be put in place in order for you to have an effective response in the communications space in terms of dialogue that needs to take place for an anti-Black racism statement internally and externally. Really, if these 12 items are there, you've already done the work. And when I looked at Grunig's excellence theory the first year, maybe 2014, I had an appreciation for I&D being able to do this, but it's not just I&D. It's I&D with leadership. It's entrepreneurship. It's It's leadership that's specific to managing by walking around. And as I explained, Jeffrey was that leader. He walked around and you didn't know who he was, but he really had an open door policy, even to the point where his office moves a lot. You're not even sure where to find him, but he's always everywhere. Social responsibility, it's an expectation because it's the dialogue on the street. So even if it's not about your employees, it's definitely about your clients and customers. The conversation is taking place in corporate Canada. There is a Black North initiative being led now. So corporations in Canada are putting themselves at the forefront of this dialogue to make a significant and systemic change. But it's the culture. You know, everything that I talked about is about the culture. Customer experience isn't all about the customer. It actually starts by focusing on employees and creating a cohesive culture. Yasmin mentioned it. Internally, have the dialogue among your teammates, have the dialogue in your hospitals. How do I deal with staff? How do I deal with clients? How do I deal with patients? You know, how do I believe stories? How do I, you know, look at all of the issues. When you look at all the crisis communication issues, it usually starts with culture. So start within. And lastly, I would say that that's the call to action. It's about the culture. So wherever you sit in communications, PR, communications, marketing, HR, I&D, wherever you sit, what's beautiful about that space is that you are looking both internally and externally. So continue to do that. Listen and find the words to engage and support. Have fluid decision-making so that your teams are, you're hearing what really is the next set of action that needs to be taken. And then externally, then you'll be able to create an authentic message. And I mean, it hurts. I personally am offended when people talk about, you know, the corporate response is sort of light and give me some more meat and detail about it. And I think that's our role. Like, we have to make sure that our leadership is crafting authentic, meaningful, measurable responses, because to go out there, we end up then having to deal with a crisis. Clearing the cognitive dissonance, I provided some references to some books and some materials near the end, including some wonderful discussion about culture makers and change in the organizations from a management consulting perspective, right out to some research on the right side that's specific to what's happening in Canada. And that essentially is the conclusion. And I hope that I've left enough time for you all to digest this amount of work, but to get it started. Thank you.
Well, Gail, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, Marissa King said we could sit here all day and all afternoon talking about this and listening to the great research. I am thrilled and humbled that somebody would take, you know, lessons learned from my class in 2014 and then, you know, really make it, you know, make the connection, right? And I think that those connections are really important. And I think, you know, when you look at it, organizations have to fully understand their entire platform of influence in society. And and this is a really important and yeah, I guess difficult for some organizations, but you know, these are they're difficult because they haven't thought about them, right? They don't understand the context that what they're living in. And I think I would hope that those who are operating at a high level in communications and public relations and are providing that trusted advisor, right? It's not a conversation that is new to them, right? And especially if it's a lived experience,
Right.
such as yours, you know. And you know, one of the concepts that they talk about was this notion of requisite variety, right? Do we have the requisite variety within our workforce that represent the context of influence that we operate within as well? And you know, it would be so deafening not to be having this conversation.
Yes.
As difficult as it might be, and as difficult as it continues to be. Obviously, we live in a world where our neighbors to the south are engaged in not just a political revolution or civil war, but a cultural civil war that manifests itself every day on social media. Every day I look at videos and I think, how's this happen? But that's the world we live in. So there's much to talk about, and I'm going to see if we have questions. We have lots and lots of accolades, which I knew that there would be.
Thank you.
And, people that are, will probably reach out to you as well to find a way to address some of the issues. I'll give you the experience that's happening at McMaster, because I think as your alma mater, to be aware of what's happening, and especially from our own department. Our own department came out with a position statement, and one that has challenged everybody, not just as a statement, but actionable items. What are we going to do about hiring? What are we going to do about curriculum? And so measurable, actionable content. The
Right.
university has also done that. But, I think this moment has given people the opportunity to speak out. As I mentioned with Yasmin, talked about this, one of our football players talked about, he's a graduate now, I think he plays in the CFL, but he talked about the racism that he had to face as a young Black athlete, a very excellent Black athlete on our team. And yet here he was feeling that he couldn't speak up, even within a team environment like that. So, what, let's take this down to the people that are here. What are some of the first things in their agenda? What would be the first thing that they could do to start that conversation, maybe amongst themselves, but within their organization as well? If I looked at that bookshelf, if there's one book that they can start to look at, what book would that be?
So a lot of folks, this was a conversation actually that took place on Twitter. I suggested White Fragility because I think it helps to break down some of the barriers and sort of loosen you up a bit to have the dialogue. If you're not comfortable, that's why I started with that temperature check at the top. If you're not comfortable, you don't know where you belong on the scale of dialogue, you're not going to be able to have it with the meaning. So it'll just be sort of a superficial statement. So I would say, read that book. And there's some great books as well about internment and residential schools that have been written from the perspective of the Indigenous population. That also has a lot of experience, sort of history and context to help people understand the mentality behind racism. And then take that information and knowledge, and you're sort of, I'm more in the middle now, I'm okay talking about it, but I'm not sure. And then bring that into your neighbors, have the dialogue at the dinner table, have the dialogue, on your team in the leadership circle, and then say, okay, where do we take this from here? I think if I had to compare what happened at Accenture, I would say that Jeffrey was very open to having that conversation because we already started to have a Black employee resource group. So we were already broaching those conversations. And one of the first activities we had was we brought in the Ontario Black History Society former president, Rosemary Sadler, who I happen to know personally because I grew up in church with her. But she really gave us sort of the baseline of racism across Canada and Black people across Canada. So she went from coast to coast and she said, here's a Black population, this is a Black population. And we're like, oh my God, where did they come from? And we're like, well, some of them came out of the Loyalists from Harriet Tubman. Others were, settlers here, and then there was immigration. So I think it's important to just understand the baseline history.
No, and be committed to learning more and asking questions and
Yes.
and being challenged on assumptions. Yes. I think that's an important one. Martin Waxman has asked a question.
Yes.
What effect do you think the boycott Facebook of social media ads initiatives will have going forward on social media in general?
See, I think this is why this internal dialogue for me was so important, because when Black Lives Matters is no longer trending, are we going to hold our media to account? And I think it's important. Like, I really would love to see journalists and publicists and everywhere that we sit in communications, PR, advertising, to hold each other accountable, because it sort of went out of control. I think there's still a space for Facebook. I think the boycotting is going to be effective for a moment, but overall, like this whole, when number 45 got into power, it was this visceral dialogue about fake news. We have to stand up for the industry collectively, not just the journalists. We rely on them to push and amplify our messages. So boycotting Facebook in a moment will be fine. It probably helps them to be more accountable to how they use advertising and how they use dialogue. But Twitter will have the same problem, and IG will have the same problem, and TikTok. So as these different apps grow up, I think it's for our public, our profession, to help hold them accountable for the way that they use advertisement and this freedom of speech.
Yeah, which that is painted from a really American conception, right? This notion that
Right.
my freedom of speech, trumps all of, I hate that word, trumps all of your other rights as well, because
Right.
my voice is better than and more important than your voice.
And I
Christine
think,
has asked a question. She said, do you have any advice for getting employee resource groups off the ground? And do you know of any groups similar to the Canadian Council of Business Leaders Against Anti-Black Systemic Racism that are coming together for NGOs or others in the non-corporate space?
it's a good question. The NGOs, that is another. I don't know of anyone that's starting the dialogue, but I think even in that corporate circle with Black North and that was started by I don't remember his name now, but regardless, I think two key people are missing from that table: NGOs and corporate communications. Or public relations firms. Those are the two areas that have not thus far been represented. You've got finance, you've got securities, law firms as well has not been represented, but it depends on putting your hand up. So I would suggest that if you're interested, absolutely reach out to the organizers. They're just now getting started. They just identified a chair. They're really just in the early stages of mobilizing. So this is the time to get in and say, hey, I think we're missing a perspective, which is NGOs. The other part of the question, I think you had in terms of ERGs starting up. It takes one person to start, but I would say if you recognize that there's not an employee resource group, be that one. We have a chapter in Niagara that is led by a Caucasian woman, because we don't have the population in Niagara for a Black or Indigenous representation. So she put her hand up and said, hey, we have an office here and we need to have this representation and dialogue. And she is just as active as everyone else. The idea is not to be insular. The idea is to have an ERG so that other people can learn about the conversation that's been happening from out of slavery has been, Black people have to know the culture of white people, but white people have not understood and known the culture of Black people. So this is the time to do that. This is the time to have that dialogue. Niagara has a huge Nathaniel Dett chorale. Nathaniel Dett is a chorale. If anyone's seen my IG, whenever I have the live music, Nathaniel Dett is a church in the Niagara area. There was a huge Black population in Niagara as well. So there's a history that's missing. And if anyone is in an area where you don't have Black representation, by all means, start a Black group.
Yeah, and just in the professional communications, public relations sphere, in the US, and it hasn't crossed the border here in Canada, but the Public Relations Society of America, Institute of Public Relations, the Page Society, Black Public Relations Association have all come together to create this group called Diversity Action Alliance. Now it's been there. It started about a year ago, so it's not something that started as a result of what just happened.
Right.
And it really started as an idea of how do we open the door to this of this industry to more Black students, right? How do they begin to see public relations as a representative place where they can be successful in as well? So that might be something that could also start here within the public relations community here in Canada as well.
Yes. And I think that's a good segue into next week's conversation.
Yes, well, I'll talk about that as we wrap up. But Marissa King said a key takeaway for me is that white people, including me personally as a white woman, need to do our part to carry the load. People, Black, Indigenous people of color, individuals can't do it alone. We expect them to do the work alone for too long. So now I wonder about the balance of doing the work as a white woman and leaning on people of color, individuals, communities. For example, if you do not have a diverse workplace, how fair is it to expect that a few Black employees you have to engage in a conversation with you and share their experiences with you? It feels like that would be furthering the burden of racism that they've been carrying along for a while. What are your views on striking the balance?
It is what you said, Marissa. It is you carrying more of the load. I mean, at work, yes, I have involved myself in the dialogue of doing some of the work, and there's a debate about that. This is not my problem. I can't break down the systems, but we're all at different stages. We are not a monolith. We are all at different stages of our experience in racism. I took 2 weeks to cocoon, for sure. It was exhausting. I was tired. I was dealing with conversations, with my friends and colleagues and parents even. My parents at 70 and 80 have had this triggering sort of response of so many eras of, civil rights movement and, colonialism and independence in the Caribbean, and then coming to Canada and thinking it'll be better, and then it wasn't. And so we are all at different stages of it. I would suggest that, on a temperature check. I mean, we had an open dialogue, and Accenture did not expect any of us to take the reins and do the work. We did it in collaboration, but all of us as Black employees at Accenture were at different levels of support. I needed to cocoon, and I came out of that. I'm rested. We had a mental health support. And again, we're all at different levels. So those who could help did help. Those who couldn't gave some direction and said, please carry on. So I would say you need to do a temperature check, Marissa, and see where everyone is at and where and how they can help. But there's a ton of resources out there to assist as well, because at the end of the day, it's the dominant coalition that needs to make these systemic changes.
Right, and that's perhaps where allyship really comes to play, right? To be able to help, as Virginia Griffith said, share the load, right? Share the load as we walk into these difficult times. And Christine also said, the emotional attacks that I see on our Black, Indigenous, people of color staff carrying, one of my peers likens it to juggling with cactuses, or is that cacti? At best, and exploitation at worst. I think we can offer to pay people at work for the work to not expect it for free.
Yep, that is also something that was discussed in the public sphere. For those who are anti-oppression and anti-Black racism advocates and consultants, come in and talk to us about anti-Black racism in the workplace. Okay, but there's a fee. And I think that we have to value the work. As I said to folks, and I said here on this call, people do PhDs in social studies and humanities and anti-Black racism and history. Like this is heavy study. I mean, if people ask me what a resource book looked like, I would say to my daughter, well, you studied African history and I studied Caribbean history, and then there's somebody who studied humanities, and there's somebody who studied anthropology. Like, this is what is rooted in all of these studies. So it's a lot of work. And there are people who have really great systems. The one slide that I showed here, this woman is, what is her? She's out of the US. I happen to.
Dr. Barbara Love, is that who it is?
I can't see the Attaway group. Yes. So it's a lady out of the U.S., out of Chicago. But we also have the Kojo Institute. Kojo Institute is Kike Ojo Thompson. She has been doing anti-Black racism studies since, oh my goodness, 20 years, mainly out of public sector. But she definitely has all of the theories and the concepts and the methodology to sort of unravel systemic racism in the workplace.
Yeah, Sarah Govine said, thank you for this inspiring, courageous conversation. I'd love to hear whether you feel we might be at a tipping point in Canada for anti-racism. Sorry, she continued it down. I had to go back to it. If so, what can we do to help carry on the momentum?
Do just this. Bring the conversation and dialogue into the workplace. Bring it into your homes. Bring it into your churches, synagogues, places of worship. Bring it everywhere. It has to happen. Patriot Act, Hassam Nyaji is very open about anti-Black racism in the South Asian community. We have to have the dialogue. That's the only way it will change. It's no different than the dialogue about, our Muslim brothers and sisters and the challenges that they've had. We have to talk about it everywhere because, like I said, racism is layered in everything. So just keep the dialogue open, lean on the resources that you have, and talk to the dominant coalition in your organization so that we put out statements that actually have some grit behind them. That's how the dialogue will change, because yes, we are at a tipping point, but if we don't have meaningful, measurable action within an organization, it's for nothing.
So it's 1 o'clock in Toronto in Southern Ontario. And we've committed to having that, although scheduling and time is a white concept, right? It's a very European concept. So we could, as we said, we could go on all day about this. And I really appreciate the time and effort, Gail, that you've put into setting the context for this conversation that we are going to have. Next week, our very own Charlene Carrington is going to talk about Black Representation Matters and the study that she did for her MCM capstone, interviewing 21 Black women consultants in the public relations sphere. And we'll see more of them as they roll out and people confirm that of their participation as well. Gail, how do we get a hold of you? What's your follow-up? If people want to get a hold of you, where's that slide? Where's that last slide?
I know, I prayed for humility, so I didn't add one. LinkedIn really is the best. I'm gail.strachan at accenture.com to continue the conversation. And of course, LinkedIn and Twitter, I'm Gail Strachan. So you can find me on public media, on social media.
This has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. We'll fix that glitch when we post the recorded session for us. And everybody, please reach out, have this conversation. And Gail, the question was, can we share your PowerPoint with those that we have their addresses here?
Yes, I think you have a PDF copy, so that we can share that, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Next week, same time, same place. Charlene yes. Carrington, Black Representation Matters. Have a good week, everybody.